The ternary operator is a shorthand structure that assigns different values to a variable depending on whether a condition is true or false. The ternary operator consists of a question mark and a colon. It gets its name because it's normally used with three values or expressions. The first of these is a condition that follows the assignment operator. The condition is followed by a question mark. To the right of the question mark is the value you want to assign if the condition is true. Next comes a colon, and then the value you want to assign if the condition is false. In effect, it's a shorthand way of writing this if-else conditional statement. There's a simple example of the ternary operator in action in this file, ternary_01.php, which you can find in the Chapter 3, 03_05 folder of the exercise files. On line 2, a value is assigned to the variable answer, and then on line 4, we use the ternary operator to assign a value to result. This is the condition. To the right of the question mark is the value that will be assigned to result if the condition evaluates to true, and after the colon is the value that will be assigned to result if the condition evaluates to false. Well, as every fan of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy will tell you, it took the computer deep thought 7.5 million years to work out that 42 was the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. So if answer isn't 42, well, let's see what happens. The browser will tell us, indeed, keep calculating. But if we change answer to 42, save and reload, we know that 42 is indeed the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. Using the ternary operator to assign a value depending on whether a condition is true or false is extremely convenient. It certainly involves a lot less typing than an if-else conditional statement, but it can seem rather cryptic until you get used to it. Occasionally, you'll see an even more cryptic version of the ternary operator, and there's an example of that here in this file, ternary_02.php, which is also in the exercise files for this video. In this script, 20 is assigned to unit cost, and then we use the ternary operator to assign a value to wholesale price. Unit cost is being used here as the condition, and there is nothing between the question mark and the colon. What this means is that if the value to the left of the question mark evaluates to true, it's then assigned to the variable, so unit cost will be assigned to wholesale price. But if this evaluates to false, then the value after the colon will be used instead. So let's just try this out in a browser. And it displays wholesale price as being 20. And the reason that has happened is that unit cost is 20, and any number apart from 0 is considered by PHP to be implicitly true, or a truthy value. So because this is a truthy value, it's assigned to wholesale price. But if you don't have a truthy value here, then this will be used as the default. Now this might seem like a good idea, but it's got several flaws. Let's change unit cost to 0 and save that, and then refresh the page in the browser. And wholesale price is now 25. And that's because 0 is regarded by PHP as being false. It's implicitly false. It's a falsy value. So this equates to false. So 25 is assigned to wholesale price. But imagine if this was being used to calculate an invoice. A promotional free gift would be charged at completely the wrong price. And another problem arises if the variable being used as the condition doesn't exist. Let's comment out unit cost here on line 2, and then save that and reload the page in the browser. Down here we can see that that value 25 has been assigned, but we've got this notice about an undefined variable, unit cost. Now many developers tend to ignore such notices, but they're often a sign that something's wrong with your script. Using the shorter version of the ternary operator like this to set a default value is unreliable, and we'll look at more robust solutions in the next video. However, using the ternary operator to assign different values depending on whether a condition is true or false is a good idea. As a reminder, this is how it's used. The condition follows the assignment operator and is followed by a question mark. To the right of the question mark is the value you want to assign if the condition is true. Next comes a colon, followed by the value if the condition is false. It's a convenient shorthand way of writing this if-else conditional statement. It involves less typing, and anything that saves effort is worth adding to your knowledge of PHP. In the previous video, we saw the problems caused by attempting to set a default value using the shortened form of the ternary operator. Let's look at more robust solutions for setting a default value. I'll also show you a useful shortcut to test for true or false. I've copied the code from the previous video into default_01.php, which you can find in the chapter 3, 03_06 folder of the exercise files. Line 2 has been commented out, so unit cost doesn't exist. And when we try to use it with the short form of the ternary operator to set a default value, we do get the correct default, but we also get this notice about an undefined variable, which indicates there's probably something wrong with the script. If we uncomment that line, unit cost does exist. Let's just save that and reload the page in the browser. And now we get the default value of 25. But unit cost does actually have a real value. The value is 0. And PHP treats 0 as false. That's why it ignores unit cost here and assigns the value 25. And that may or may not be what you want. With the short form of the ternary operator, you actually don't have any choice. In PHP 7, there's a new operator that solves both problems, and it's remarkably similar. Instead of a question mark and a colon, it consists of 2 question marks. So I'm going to remove that colon and add a second question mark, and this is what is known in PHP 7 as the null coalesce operator. If the variable on the left of the operator is null or doesn't exist, the operator skips over it without raising an error and assigns the value on the right. Now I'm going to try this in my browser, but remember this is a PHP 7 operator. You won't be able to test this if you're still running PHP 5. But do hang around because I'll be showing you a solution that works in PHP 5 in a short while. So let's just save that and load this into a browser. And the value that has been assigned is 0. That's why it's called the null coalesce operator. 0 is a real value. So is an empty string. This operator, the 2 question marks, is concerned only with null. In other words, no value at all. So if we comment out unit cost, it no longer exists, and we refresh the page in the browser, it now assigns 25 as the default value. And the important thing to note here is that we don't get any error message. And a useful thing about the null coalesce operator is that you can chain it. So if we add in another non-existent value here, we'll call it non-existent, and then another null coalesce operator, save and reload, we still get that default of 25, but no error is raised either about unit cost or about non-existent. But if I uncomment that line, save and refresh, the value is 0. So it takes the first value that is genuine, even if it's 0 or an empty string that PHP normally treats as false. It only skips over null values, in other words, ones that don't exist. So that's the null coalesce operator in PHP 7. We need to use an alternative approach to setting a default value in older versions of PHP, and also we need to use that alternative approach in PHP 7 if you don't want a falsy value like 0 to be used as the default. So let's switch to this other file here, default_02.php, and what we need to do is to create a conditional statement using if-else, and the condition needs to check if the variable exists. So if PHP has a function called isSet that checks whether a variable exists. So between a pair of parentheses, you need to add the variable that you want to check. That's unit cost. And then between the curly braces we need to set the value of wholesale price, and we'll set that as the value of unit cost. But if unit cost doesn't exist, if it's not set, we need an else block, and in there wholesale price will be set to our default, which we'll call 25. So if we save that and then test this in a browser, this will work in all versions of PHP. We get the value 25. Unit cost has been commented out on this line, so it doesn't exist. So this fails. We get the value which is assigned here. If we uncomment this line and save and reload the page, this time we get 0 because unit cost has the value of 0. But let's say you don't want to use the value if it's 0 or if it's an empty string, in other words, a falsy value. To check that, you need to add a second condition to the if block. So after that closing parenthesis of is set, we need 2 ampersands, the AND operator, and then just the variable itself, unit cost. Now, I have to admit that when I was learning PHP many years ago, this type of condition had me scratching my head for a while. The first part of the condition, is set, is checking whether the variable exists. If it doesn't, the whole condition will fail. But if it does exist, the second part of this condition applies the rules of what PHP regards as true or false. So let's just review what PHP regards as implicitly false. In addition to the Boolean keyword false, the following values are treated as false: 0 as a number or string, an empty string, an empty array, null including unset variables, and a simple XML object created from empty tags. Everything else is true. Consequently, if a variable contains any value other than the Boolean false or the very short list of implicitly false values, it must be true. So we don't need to check if unit cost is 0 or an empty string. This condition will fail if unit cost is implicitly false, and it will succeed if unit cost is implicitly true. So if we just save this and then refresh the browser, we now get the value 25. Unit cost is 0. 0 is treated as being implicitly false, so even though unit cost is set, unit cost here is false. But if we change this to a different value, let's change it to 1, save and reload, then this time the value that is assigned to wholesale price is 1. And something you need to be careful about, don't think that a negative value will also be false. If I make that -1 and save and refresh, the value that is assigned is -1. The only number that is false is 0. So we've looked at a couple of ways of assigning a default value, even if a variable doesn't exist. The solution in PHP 7 is to use the null coalesce operator, which skips over null values without raising an error. The solution that works in all versions of PHP is to use an if-else conditional statement. One final word of caution. Both of these solutions assume that the variable contains the right type of data. If the value has come from an external source, such as an online form, you should conduct further checks before using it. The purpose here has been to demonstrate the basic principle, rather than providing a solution that will work in every case. As you advance with a programming language like PHP, you appreciate more and more that there's rarely, if ever, a single solution that fits every scenario. It's time for another challenge to test your PHP skills. A useful application of conditional statements is presenting different content to a website's visitors, depending on whether they're administrators, registered members, or just visiting as guests. In the Chapter 303_07 folder of the exercise files is this web page called different.php. At the moment it contains only HTML and a link to a style sheet. The challenge is to add the necessary PHP code to create two different versions of this web page, one for members and the other for non-members. If you examine the HTML, you'll see that the markup uses three classes. The header uses the both class. This indicates that the header should be in both versions of the page. The next section uses the class non-members. This needs to be only in the version for non-members. The next section has the class members, so it should be only in the version for members. And the final section has two divs. The first one is for both, so it should be in both versions. The second one is for members, so it should be in the version for members only. And then finally, the footer uses both, so this should be in both versions. To show you what the two versions of the web page should look like, I've included in the exercise files non_members.html and members.html. So let's take a look at them in a browser. This is the version for members, and the sections for members only have a different background color. So that's what your members page should look like, and this is the one for non-members. Non-members, everything has a white background, so that should be very easy to recognize. Now, although I've created two different files as a guide, what you need to do is to use PHP code to present two different versions of the same file, as though they're being viewed by someone visiting as a guest or someone logged in as a registered member. Let's just go back to that page. So it's different.php. Obviously, I don't expect you to create a login system. Create a variable that indicates whether the visitor is logged in or not, and hard code it into this page, different.php. The real challenge is to add the code that displays the different output, depending on whether the visitor is logged in. The solution is remarkably simple, but it might not be immediately obvious. So here are some pointers that you might find helpful. PHP was designed to be embedded in HTML. This chapter has focused on two main themes: what PHP regards as true and false, and various control structures that determine which code is executed depending on one or more conditions. One final clue: the solution does not involve using echo. This challenge shouldn't take you more than 5 or 10 minutes to complete. Even if you think it's beyond you, just pause for a short while to consider how it might be done. And in the next video, I'll show you my solution. The challenge was to take a single web page and to display different versions of it to visitors depending on whether they're logged in as registered members. We don't have a registration and login system, so the solution involves hard coding a variable to indicate the visitor's status. So I'm going to begin by creating a PHP block above the doctype declaration. And then inside that PHP block, I'm going to initialize a variable called member and set its value to 0. PHP treats 0 as false, so this will indicate that the visitor is not logged in as a registered member. Now we need to deal with displaying the different sections. The header, that has got the both class, so it'll be displayed to both members and non-members, so we don't need to do anything here. But the section that begins on line 16, the class is non-member, so this is for non-members only. We need to use a PHP conditional statement to control this. So on the previous line, insert a PHP block, and inside that block we'll have the if keyword, and that's followed by the condition. This section needs to be displayed if the visitor is not a member. PHP uses an exclamation mark as the logical not operator to reverse whether a variable or expression evaluates to true or false. So we can use exclamation mark member to mean not a member. Above the doctype we set member to 0, which is false, and putting an exclamation mark in front of member here reverses the meaning. So this condition will now be true, so it will show this to non-members. But if we change the value of member to true, this will then be false, so it will hide it from members. After the condition, you normally use an opening curly brace, but we're working with a lot of code in this file, So I think it'll make the code easier to read if we use the alternative syntax and add a colon after the condition instead of a curly brace. So what should go inside this if block? It might sound odd, but we don't need any PHP code at all. All that's necessary is to wrap the existing HTML inside the block. So let's just scroll down, and between these two sections add a new PHP block. And we're using the alternative syntax, so we need to have the end if keyword followed by a semicolon. Now, if you find this confusing, remember that PHP is designed to be embedded in HTML. The code inside a conditional statement doesn't have to be PHP. It can also be static HTML. All that the PHP engine is concerned about is whether the condition is true or false. If it's true, it processes whatever is inside the block, whether it's PHP code or static HTML. If the condition is false, everything inside the block is ignored. So the next section is for members only. We need a new if block, and this time the condition will be member. And we're using the alternative syntax, so a colon, and then we need to scroll down to the end of that section, a new PHP block, and the end if keyword, followed by a semicolon and the closing PHP tag. In this next section, we've got two divs. The first div has the class both, so that's going to be shown to both members and non-members. We don't need to do anything here, but we do need to deal with this one that's got the class of members. So we need another conditional statement there. So that's a PHP block and if member, followed by a colon, closing PHP tag, and the end if needs to go between the closing div tag and the closing section tag. So PHP and then end if and our closing PHP tag. The footer has the class of both, so we don't need to do anything there. So that is all the PHP code that we need. Let's just save that file and now view it in a browser. And this shows us the version for non-members. All of the background is white, so that has worked perfectly. So if we go back to the editing program and scroll up to the top and change member from 0 to 1, member will now be true. So if I save that and view the page in the browser again, this time we get the version for members, and we've got that colored background for the sections that are for members only. So how did you do with that challenge? Did you have a solution that was similar to mine? If you think this can be achieved with CSS, think again. Let's go back to the exercise files for this video, back to my editing program. And I've got this other page here, different_css.php. At the top, member is set to 0. Then in the head of the document, I'm using conditional statements to control the CSS. So if the member is true, non-members will display none, otherwise members will display none. And if we run this in the browser, this displays the non-members version perfectly, but if I right-click and view page source and scroll down, there in the HTML is the information that is for members only. So this is totally insecure. But if we go back to the editing program and to my version, and then change member from 1 to 0, save that and refresh the page in the browser, there is the non-members version. And if we right-click and view the page source, we've got the both section there, we've got the non-members section there and the both section, but the material for members only is not even here. It's not just hidden in the browser, it isn't even here. The PHP engine has served different content depending on the visitor's status, and that's an extremely powerful aspect of web development with PHP. So how did you find the challenge? Although the solution involved very little code, it highlights some important aspects of working with PHP, using implicitly true or false values, reversing the Boolean value with an exclamation mark, the logical not operator, and wrapping static HTML in conditional statements to serve different content to visitors depending on whether they've logged in.